Welcome to the Future of Field Service podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro, coming to you from Palm Springs, California. So those of you that regularly watch or listen to the podcast would know that typically I am in my home office. Today we are filming on site at Field Service Palm Springs, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my friend Roy Dockery, who is the Vice President of Customer Care at Swisslog. Thanks for being here, Roy.
Thank you. Good to be back at an in-person event here in Palm Springs when it's not Coachella.
So, yes, true.
Like November.
Is this your first in-person event post-COVID?
It's not. I was at the TSA event a couple of weeks ago in Las Vegas, so that would have been my first conference, but I've been well back into traveling since May. So,
do you know what's funny? Today's podcast, the one that actually published today, is Kevin Bowers from TSIA.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, so, all right, cool. So we're here, we're back in Palm Springs. Happy to be back at the field service event. Roy and I were catching up yesterday, reflecting on the first podcast you were on, which was episode 2. I think this week we hit 137, so it's been a while. But we're going to talk about the same topic today.
Yeah.
And we're going to do that because I think we were maybe a little ahead of the game when we talked about the topic the first time, which is recruiting, hiring, retention, right? So when you were on the podcast the first time, we were talking about the talent gap, which has only exacerbated as a challenge being talked about here, right? So you and I both observed over the last couple days, everyone is... It's part of like every session, right?
Yeah. Great Resignation is
the Great Resignation. Yes. So we started talking about this a while ago, and I realize it is a growing challenge for folks. But I like your take a lot and have a lot of respect for it because you think people need to take a little bit more responsibility for the problem. And so I want to kind of talk about that again today because I think that the conversation warrants a revisit because people are really struggling with this right now. And I think some of the thoughts you have around how and why people should look at their role in solving the problem a little bit deeper is good. So give us your take on this.
Yeah, so one, right, you have the Great Resignation that's around people leaving and, jobs and purpose, right? There's all these assumptions. No one really knows why people are leaving jobs. Some people are taking pay cuts. Some people are taking promotions. There's remote work being factored into it, flexibility, work-life balance. But when we look at it from a field service perspective, right, like we're here now, I mean, probably a couple of years after we originally had these conversations. We also talked about it in magazine interviews. Mm-hmm. And so like you fast forward, I've been talking about recruitment at these events for 5 years. So before the Great Resignation, before the pandemic, I was trying to, raise the awareness and like make the clarion call that this is going to be a problem. Like we can't keep hiring people the same way because on top of people resigning to go into different fields, we had an aging workforce in field service, right? And they're retiring. And a lot of them now are retiring early or just taking advantage of benefits. There were health concerns, right, with entering facilities and travel. And so the same problem is there. It just got exacerbated, right? So just like here at the conference, everyone's talking about digital transformation. Everybody wanted video assistance tools. All of those things got accelerated and implemented during the pandemic because they became a necessity. Mm-hmm. So like I think you and I were talking about it 135 episodes ago because we didn't want to have to be reactive.
Right.
So we were trying to be proactive in saying we can't keep hiring each other's technicians, right? And it's still happening now, right? I'm experiencing attrition right now. It's not significant. Our attrition rate is still less than 10%. But I'm losing people to other field service organizations.
Right.
And you're overpaying for that talent.
Mm-hmm.
So like I have an employee work for me for 6 or 7 months and they can go get a job just because they have field service on their resume. So now people can jump from company to company and we're seeing that. And it's like no one took the initiative, right, to be able to develop a workforce. Mm-hmm. And, I was talking to somebody last night at a dinner, right, about that farming. Like we've been hunters for so long. And when you say take responsibility, we have to take responsibility for the fact that we got lazy in our recruitment.
Right.
We got lazy in our development, right? We just were comfortable getting people who had industry knowledge, and not having to go through the basics. So when it comes from a training perspective, when we look historically 30 years ago at field service, when we were pulling people out of apprenticeships and out of electricians and mechanics and in different union shops, and taking them through all the building blocks, right? The foundational aspects of our business, our technology, our software. Like, a lot of us got lazy. Like, we don't want to do hand tools, right? We don't want to teach people about multimeters and reading diagrams, even though that training takes like 2 days.
Right.
It's not a 3-month long process. And so for me, being someone that's ex-military, right, seeing people who are 17 and 18 years old be able to be trained in anything, as long as you give everyone the same essential training, you give everyone the same building blocks. And so my team and in our organization, we're like, we can do the same thing. We've effectively done the same thing because we hire people right out of the military that don't have industry experience, which is consistent across field service, but you have less people who join the military.
Right.
You have less people who are getting out of the military, and you just have more competition now because everyone figured out that equation, right? Everybody figured out that hack. So it's like, let me go hire military people. So even that's becoming ridiculously competitive. So switching to and taking responsibility for the fact that if you can't bring somebody in that has the skills that your organization needs, that has the behavior that meets your culture, if you can't bring those people in and train them, that's not a talent gap problem. That's a training problem, right? That's a training and development issue. And that's what I think a lot of companies are wrestling with right now, because it's not like there aren't people who have skills and probably the right behavior. They don't have the experience that you've been taking for granted and substituting that for an effective training program. So that's kind of my approach, and it's just we have to own it, right? Like it's all the generations and people don't stay, right? Everything gets blamed on us millennials, right? Oh, millennials don't stay at jobs, but it doesn't seem like Gen Xers are staying at jobs either, or that baby boomers are staying at jobs. So people just have transition, but you have to be able to develop, and we've got to get back into farming and developing talent. And, and the cool thing about field service, like at my company, right, I was a field service technician. I'm the vice president of customer care. But we have people from field service in every aspect of our business. They're customer success managers, they're product managers, they're software engineers, they're in our development team and our engineering department. So it's not only a good place to farm talent for the field, it's a good place to farm talent for the organization. We have people in sales that come from field service, right, and installation and things like that. So if we make more of an investment in bringing those people in and be willing to develop them and let them move through the organization, that can help with the retention as well, right? Because you might not retain them in a role, but then the ultimate goal is to retain that talent within the company as well.
Right. Okay. So the reality is hiring based on experience, which is what a lot of the people at this conference are still trying to do, and they're very frustrated that it's not working. The experience is becoming extinct and or far too expensive, right?
Yes.
So that is the reality that hopefully, a couple years later, people are now ready to hear. So let's talk about some of the antidotes to that, right? So if we can all accept that that is fact, and hopefully people are coming around to the idea that you can't just keep looking for people that have 5 years, 10 years of experience. You need to start thinking differently.
Yeah.
There's a couple areas we need to think about, right? So one of the things that we've talked about is sort of the branding problem or the PR problem that this industry has, right? In the sense that younger people just don't know that there are viable and fulfilling career opportunities at companies like Swisslog, right?
Yeah.
Like they're just not known. So what are your thoughts on that part of the solution? Like, how do you as a company, as a leader, and us as an entire industry make progress in creating better awareness around field service as a career?
Yeah, right. And I think to go back to what we said before, the first thing is you have to accept that you have a problem, right? So, and because of the fact that we haven't been leveraging what's available, that like once you accept that, then you have to be, okay, what am I doing wrong now? Because you've got to admit you're doing something wrong. Hiring just for experience is wrong. It's ineffective. And it has a lifespan that we're running into right now is ending. So that's the first thing. It was like, okay, so then what areas am I not looking at?
Okay, so let's assume that we have an understanding among people we're speaking to that the idea of hiring based on experience is no longer an option, okay? So one of the things we need to think about then is how we create more awareness about the career opportunities that exist in field service, right? So you're talking about really a lot of different industries, a lot of different types of companies and types of work, but all things that kind of fly under the radar of, you know, when you ask a kid what they want to be when they grow up, they say a doctor or a nurse or a teacher. They don't say like a field technician because it's just not something that is widely known as an option, right? So what are your thoughts on how we, as organizations, as an industry, collectively, like how do we overcome that problem?
Yeah, and I think, right, and I think, one, we have to look at it collectively as an industry, right? Like computer science, programmers, right? Like artificial intelligence, like all of those things are industry. So there's outreach within that industry. There's like the progression of this is what you do in high school, this is what you do in college or in technical school. Like we've been taken for granted, like the volume of people we already had within the workforce, that I think field service is never really, and even now, right, with the podcast, and like we've never really marketed and publicized ourselves as an industry. So I think one thing is, even with IFS and what you do on the podcast, it's like, okay, how do we reach back and say, how do we do outreach to high schools to let people know you can graduate from high school, go to a 2-year technical school, and then get a $50,000+ a year job, right? How do you go to the technical schools and say, if you have people graduating with EET or, you know, associate's degrees in information technology, you know, let's move it forward, because it's hard for us. One thing for field service, a lot of us, it's not like we have an office where we're hiring 50 people, right? I have 150 technicians spread across like 40 states and an entire continent. So individually, I think it's a lot harder for us to do that outreach, but then collectively, right? When you look at the number of field service technicians in any given city, not necessarily in a given company, because we're talking about HVAC, retail, hospitality, restaurants, like they're everywhere. But like you said, no one knows that. And I remember talking to my daughter's middle school principal, and I asked him, I said, and because he also had some relationships with the high school, and I said, if I asked a class of high school students right now, who wants to make over $50,000 a year and travel 75% of the time? It's like, how many of them you think would say yes? And he was like 75% of them. And I was like, that's what field service is, but nobody knows what it is. So, right, like, one, like we need like an outreach arm, right? We could let Sarah be the face of outreach to schools and in that space, because I think we need to collectively foster that that reality, right? Because we all struggle from it. But even if you've got 8,000 technicians or 2,000 technicians, they're spread all over the country. So I think having that intentionality as an industry to come together to say, we need to reach into education, we need to work with workforce development, we need to work with vocational rehab through the VA, and just say these jobs are options, right? Like you don't need a bunch of experience. You need an aptitude, you need the right behavior, you need a skill set that's trainable, and then we can get you into the field. So I think we've got to make it public, we've got to make it known as an industry, not just as employers. So we're going to have to collaborate a little bit instead of hiring all of each other's employees, because in the next 5 years, all of those people are going to be gone, 5 to 10 years. So I think there's collaboration required in that to kind of market that in the, like I said, in workforce development, in the education sector, and in like secondary and vocational education. So I think that'll be important. And and then on top of that, we just have to commit, right? Like you've got to commit to doing it different. You need a different net. You got to cast in different water, right? Like you can't keep doing it the way that you have been. That might get you people for the next year or two. But like you said, those people are becoming more expensive, right? So and then those people are just going to get hired by somebody else who will pay them more money. So we've got to learn to farm talent, and then we've got to know that talent may come to us, but when they want to move to another city, they may go work for you, right? So it's like we can't take that selfish approach, because what we're all finding right now is that when somebody wants to work from home or needs a job that's maybe in the city versus regionally, right? Like when a lot of our people, my employees leave, it's like, okay, I love field service, but I don't really want to travel outside the city. So then you go work for ATM company. There are 40,000 ATMs within like 2 hours versus 20 hospitals within, a 4-hour radius. So people are switching in between those companies to make those to make those personal life choices. And I'm like, we just have to be accepting of that. But if we're all working to increase the size of the pool by farming talent instead of just hunting it, then I think we all collectively benefit. Right. Where right now we're just robbing Peter to pay Paul, as one of my managers loves to say. Right.
Okay, so there's the PR issue, and then there's a couple other things I want to talk about. One is we talked about the military, right? And that's kind of like, if people accept they can't get someone with 5 years experience, the default then is to go try and get them from the military, right? That's kind of become the new go-to, right?
Yep.
So that doesn't mean it's a bad source. It just means that can't be your only source, right? So what other sources are you exploring or finding success with when it comes to kind of looking outside of now that as a new area of opportunity?
Yeah, and like you said, with the military, I'm ex-military, almost all my entire management team, and we're actually all ex-Navy, right? And so, but one thing we're noticing as well, it's becoming more competitive. So people coming out of the military with 3 or 4 years of experience now they can demand, or they can get a $70,000 salary in like a non-metro area because, like you said, that's the go-to now. So that's the new thing. But then also now you have no experience and expense. So now I have someone with no experience that's actually more expensive as a candidate. So the main thing we've been successful with is really just changing how we're trying to recruit and what we're looking for. So when you change your job postings, when you remove experience and specific industry knowledge, right? I'm not trying to hire a healthcare field service engineer. I'm not trying to hire a field service engineer at all because I know the industry has poor PR. Right. And if I'm trying, right, so we're focusing more. We just had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with our HR department, and I said, find me people who worked at Chick-fil-A. Like, I want customer service people. If you've got 2 years of
bacon,
right, like if you've got Chick-fil-A and you've been, and you've got a technical background. I've had my managers have walked into Best Buys, to Geek Squads that are in their territories where we have job openings, but the main thing was, it's one thing to go and try to advocate or build relationships with, and we're doing stuff with Handshake and, building relationships with technical schools. But when somebody from that technical school goes apply, but my job requirement and my job description still says 2 to 3 years of experience or an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree preferred, people are going to eliminate themselves. And so I think one of the problems we have is that even from hiring managers, right, supervisors and managers aren't really looking for people with experience, but our net is eliminating people who don't have it, either through the screening process with recruitment and HR, or because people don't apply to begin with. So one thing that we found in getting more diversity and just different types of candidates, it's removing some of the obstacles that were actually just in our job posting. So remove experience, take the industry specific stuff out of it, and just advocate for people, right? It's like a one ad for people, like not a technician.
So what's some of the terminology you use? If you don't use field service, you don't use technician, you don't use healthcare, like what does it say? Yeah,
so and when it looks at the requirements, we're recruiting for field service technicians, but when we put in experience, we want people with customer service experience. We want people who have a technical aptitude, right? So you don't have that technical experience, right? And so we really just dumb down those requirements so that we have more people to apply. Because once you can look at a resume and then get a feeling for a candidate, the issue was, my team wanted to hire different people, but they weren't applying.
Right.
So it's like, I can't hire you if you don't apply. So we kind of do it on a revolving basis. Like if we get a candidate that happened to apply and we look at their resume and be like, okay, they applied even though from our job posting, it doesn't look like they were qualified. So what we started doing is like, who have we hired lately that's like a non-traditional employee that's doing really well? And then so we continue to go and revise. And so we hired somebody recently that was an employee at Chick-fil-A, recent tech school graduate. And we're like, she's doing phenomenal. So let's put more weight on customer service. Let's get people with more of a customer service background. So it's an ongoing kind of evolution, but the first thing we did was remove education requirements because the vast majority of our employees do not have associates or bachelor degrees. Bachelor degrees, they just don't. Most of them have military experience. We reduced the amount of military experience that we required or that we had as preferred, right? And then we started focusing more on customer service because we trust our technical training program, right? We think we can get people up to speed technically. So we really want the right behavior, right? We want the right skill sets, people who are trainable, people who, who come up to speed quickly, and mostly can interact with customers. We're in healthcare. It's a high stress environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, I used to tell people that I trained when I was in the field, this job is 90% communication and 10% fixing.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the skills we started looking for. And that's the same thing when you recruit, and anytime I consult with or speak to companies that are dealing with recruitment issues, that's the first thing I tell them. Look at who your top performers are and tell me if they match your job description. And 9 times out of 10, they do not.
Right.
Like your best software engineer doesn't have a software degree.
Sure.
Right. Your best field service technician doesn't have an EET degree. Like he's, the guy from Home Depot. Or I was talking to one guy. It was the CEO's son, and we thought we were going to hate him because he was a high school graduate, but he's our best applications engineer now.
Mm-hmm.
And he had no experience whatsoever. He would have never gotten that job if he wasn't related, if it wasn't nepotism, but
right.
He was good at it, right?
So, I mean, the point that brings up, though, is then you have to be willing to take some risks, right? Because it not calculated, right? But in that example, I mean, he got the job because he was somebody's, whatever, but, the point is you might need to try some different things to see what works, but you're better off doing that than just not trying anything.
Yeah, because you have no choice, right? You have to do something different.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's like you said, it's a calculated risk. If you're hiring people who are heavier on customer service, then that means your management team has to be more intentional about training on technical. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when we hire people who are very technical, we terminate more people for behavioral issues than we do for technical competency.
Yeah, we were at the table yesterday. Marcella from Eppendorf said the same thing. Like, I hire on soft skills, I can train anything else, right?
Yeah.
So, if you think about that, you can get good soft skills from a lot of different places, right? Yeah. So to your point, if you invest in being able to train on the technical stuff, it opens up a lot of opportunities. Training is another podcast. We're not talking about that today. But there are a couple more things I want to get to. One is, so we talk about making the application process more appealing, so that, or I guess, eliminating barriers so that you can get more people to apply and not, field themselves out based on some words that are in there, right?
Yeah.
But what about the job itself, right? Because this is the other thing, you and I have talked about a bit in the past, is the idea that, like, people looking for jobs today want different things than people looking for jobs 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago did. And a lot of field service organizations haven't necessarily changed the structure of their, not just, compensation probably is the most regularly changed thing, right? But looking at, like, how are we describing the role? What parts of it are we emphasizing? Or what changes could we make as a business that we might not have thought we needed to make, but we are capable of doing to offer more flexibility or something that is appealing to people that we want to bring into the company today?
Yeah, and I think it has to do with the kind of services that we can dynamically offer as an organization. So, and we were talking to somebody, right? Field services are high demand, travel, sometimes you got to be flexible, you're on call. That's an eliminating factor for some people, right? Like when, especially people have to deal with childcare and things of that nature, having to run a call at 2:00 in the morning with no notice and you have a 4-year-old, that's just not a job that you can take. Mm-hmm. But so one of the things that we've even looked at evolving over time is like when we'll interview somebody and then we'll have multiple openings and then we can make a suggestion like, okay, maybe you take this role that is a resident for this particular hospital. Mm-hmm. And so that's all you have to do. You cover that site and you have on call, but it's once every 4 weeks. And so you create that flexibility. And a lot of it has to do with how forthright and open the candidates are about what their needs are, which I think is improving now. Mm-hmm. A lot of people didn't feel like they could, stress what they needed and the kind of flexibility they had. They think it would put their job at risk. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one thing you have to encourage people to be open, right? I don't want you to take a job that you then can't physically do as well.
I think that's another change from COVID too, though, because flexibility became, like, work from home became more common. Flexibility became a more in-demand criteria.
Yeah.
And I think it is something for field service companies to think about because each business is different, so there's no prescriptive answer. But we had a consultant on the podcast not too long ago, Lauren Winans with Next Level, and one of the things she brought up is if we know flexibility is and is going to continue to be very, very important, then again, it's another area to break out of like, well, we just can't. You know, like it's just field service, we just can't. And actually sit down and look at like, okay, operationally, are there ways we could? Like, can we do some sort of rotating schedule so that it does become possible to provide that in some way? Or is there, you know, some halfway point, right? Like maybe it's not, you know, flexibility to this degree, but you could have an extra day off every 2 weeks. You know what I mean? Like whatever it is to kind of meet in the middle if we know that that is such an important factor for people. So I think when you look at, you know, there's recruiting in terms of getting fish to bite, to get in the door, right? But then there's recruiting in the sense of, am I offering an employee value proposition that is appealing, right? And that means you need to understand what your target audience wants and needs, and that might be then a second phase of having to really examine where you're at and if you need to make some changes, right? Because just because they're telling you they want flexibility doesn't mean that you just kick them out the door. And you know, I mean, if you're going to hear that every time somebody walks in for an interview, then you have to start thinking as a company like, okay, you know, what do we do with this data?
And I think it becomes limiting to, you know, from that perspective as well, because there's a pool, and I think that's why people in field service, I'm never surprised when somebody leaves. Right? Like, it's a difficult job. Like, who wants to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Like, when I interview people, I'm like, we're crazy. Like, we're a unique breed of people, but...
You're going to love it till you hate it.
Yeah, you're going to love it till you hate it. And it's a certain dynamic of people, but I think that's why organizations also have to be intentional about not just training people, but developing them.
Right. And that was the last point I wanted to talk about, which is... You know, you have to figure out how to get more people interested in the career opportunities. You have to make sure that you are creating an employee value proposition that is appealing to the people you're trying to hire today, not the people that work for you now, right? I mean, you have to come to grips with the fact that there are realities you have to contend with, right? Like you can't just offer the same thing you've always offered and expect people to be interested in it. And while there are constrictions on how much a given industry can, you know, recreate that value proposition, I think people, again, it's another area where people are kind of lazy. Like they just default to, nope, we've hired on experience, we'll do that. Nope, this is what it is. You take it or leave it, right? And I mean, that just has to change, right? But the last area I want to talk about is this idea of retention. And I like the point you made at the beginning about maybe field service is sort of the entry level where we can bring people in without experience, without education requirements, train them on the technical parts as long as they have the soft skills and the aptitude to learn, and then farm them up for the rest of the business. So you kind of keep that continual flow. You have the talent you need when you need it, but you know going in, it's not going to stay there for 10, 15, 20, 30 years like it has in the past, right? So talk about that part.
And I think that's, and you know, I had dinner last week with an employee that was retiring after 30 years, right? And you know, I'm like, so why do you see people coming in and going? But right, people define success in different ways, right? So success was to have a job that would let me retire with a pension and I can take care of my family, right? That's a very traditional kind of concept, but people want challenges. People want, they want to do different things. They want to have transitions. Like I've had, you know, technically 5 jobs in the last 11 years, but I've worked at the same company.
Right.
So I'm not someone who wants to keep doing the same thing constantly, but luckily I've been able to find additional challenges at work. So I think, like when we bring them in, like, you know, we've hired people from the warehouse to work in technical support, right? Within an organization, we have to be focused on what skills do we have within the organization. And then when we have those foundational skills and behavior, right? If you understand my customer base, if you understand my product, if you understand our processes and our workflow and our installations, like where else can you be beneficial? So we have people that go from the field to be project engineers and then become full-fledged project managers. We have people who go to be sales, who become estimators, right? And then go from estimating to doing applications and design and go from that to being design analysts, right? So you can bring them in and they get a feel of the company, but we can get value out of them. We can get revenue out of them. But when I tell my team, if we can retain somebody in the field for 2 or 3 years, I'm happy about that. I just think the type of people that worked in the field for 30 years I just think there's less of them.
Yeah.
Right? Regardless of, like, some people will come in and they'll be happy. That's what they'll do. Other people are going to want challenges, right? They're more into software than they are into hardware. So, like, as they start working, they start leaning towards one part of the technology than other. Then find them a role in that space instead of constantly robbing from other companies, right? So, and there you said there's a risk. There's a risk I can take you from the field and put you in a more technical role and you won't get it. But you face the same risk when you take an external employee and bring them in. They may not meet your culture. They may not understand your customer base. They may not understand your products, right? So, it's a risk, but we've just got to be...
And when it comes to the overall puzzle of what we're talking about here, maybe the fact that people aren't as willing to stay still in these roles is actually something companies can use to their advantage, right?
Yeah.
I think that part of that, though, is, again, thinking ahead and making sure that you accept the reality for what it is and then work backwards on how to communicate with the employees about it, right? Like, I think, I'm not saying people only leave because they don't know the growth potential.
Yeah.
But I'm saying companies today know growth potential is very important for new employees. So if you're not communicating from the beginning what that growth potential is for them at your company, don't expect they're just going to figure it out or know it, or they're going to stick around and wait for you to communicate it, right? Like, if there's some way to provide some of that information up front on, here's what your potential is as a field service technician, but then beyond that, here's a bunch of different paths you could take within Swisslog, and, here's the different timelines that you could start exploring, whatever, I've seen people chart it out very specifically, or I've seen people just be a little bit more high level. But I think the point is, you need to understand that these people from the beginning are going to want more. So how do you kind of use that to your advantage instead of letting them just get picked off by
and especially, it was funny for me, right? So starting in the field and then moving up through the company and becoming a VP, like, I've been a vice president now for over 6 years. So I started noticing, and when you say communicating that, I think we do a good job of, sometimes we do a good job of communicating that during the interview. And like, the vice president was in the field and the person who's interviewing you was in the field, but then that's it.
Right.
So we don't keep communicating that. So I started noticing a couple of years ago, there were people who worked within our organization that never knew I was in the field. They thought I came into the company as a vice president. I'm like, no, I came in as a technician. So even like reiterating that story and keeping that narrative where, we were talking about our HR department, I'm like, I need to celebrate more when somebody leaves my organization and goes into design and applications or into estimating, like, because I don't want to make it seem like, they took from me. Like, we're retaining, and even our HR department, they joke, they were like, they have a ratio for me. It's called the internal development ratio. So it's not attrition for my team, because half of my attrition is internal. So they leave and go to other departments, and we advocate for them, we recommend them. And we also try to do individual development plans, which I think is, right, you've got targets and you've got objectives that you've got to measure, which is how we've done performance management forever. And I love the fact that our company said, okay, we're going to do that, but then we're also going to have individual development plans for everyone. So where do you want to go? What is your short-term goal? What do you want to do in the next, in the next 1 or 2 years? Where do you want to be in 2 to 5 years, right? We've had people in the field who became lawyers.
And if you think about that, like, that process serves multiple purposes, okay? I mean, because you're able then to understand what people like, where they see themselves, what their goals are, and that helps you map them into different functions of the business. But at the same time, I think when it comes to retention, it also makes them realize that Swisslog as a company is invested in their long-term potential, not just their short-term ability to help the company meet metrics.
And do a job.
So in terms of engagement and satisfaction, it's not just smart because you get an idea of what you could present to them as their next step, but you're investing in the relationship with them and creating, more loyalty, so that's kind of like the secondary benefit.
Because what you don't want them just focused on the job, right? I know the job is rob Peter, pay Paul. I know somebody else will pay you $10,000-$20,000 more than me to travel internationally until you get to go to Brazil, right? Like from a job perspective, it's very competitive. There's a lot of different places you can go work. And my management team was talking with HR. They were like, we don't try to sell people on the job. We try to sell people at Swisslog.
Right.
Everyone in my leadership team comes from the field. Everyone, every manager, every director, they all came from the field. So it's like we're examples of what we're trying to represent. And just building it in that way. So that's what we do. So, and we had that discussion with HR, and I'm like, so that's why sometimes somebody's more expensive, and we just pass on them. And it's not because they want to come here for a job that pays more money. Like, no, we want to give people an opportunity to build a career, right? So, and if your career, and I tell my employees all the time, I hold you responsible for developing your employees, even if it's developing them out of this company. So if we're developing people and helping them reach their individual potential and we don't have a position, then I'll give you a referral to go work somewhere else, right? Because you're interested in the person in their career. So if they really want to go and they've been doing project management and we had one opening but it's filled now and we may not have another one for a year or two, then fine. Like I'll give you a referral to go work somewhere as a project manager. I'll let you shadow some of our project managers so you have experience so you can intelligently speak to it during an interview, right? I've got supervisors right now that I know are interviewing for management roles, right? I've got, I encourage my managers to go for director roles, and even my directors. Like I want them to be a vice president, but I have 3 directors and there's 1 me. So 2 of you might need to go be vice president somewhere else. Or like when they take my job, I'll go somewhere else. But I think that's the thing, and you're right. Like there's more that you can sell in that story. But I do think organizations, right? Because then that changes how the entire organization looks at field service. Right. So like, can you pull from sales? Can you pull from engineering, project management? Like what's an entry level position in engineering that you can transition a field service technician to? So if you build out that map of, and we kind of know, so we'll say, hey, like, one of our people went into engineering through this role, or one of our people went into project management through this role, so we can kind of map it out. But as organizations to come together from a leadership perspective and say, okay, like if we've had success, and almost every company does, right? There's someone from field service in like every department, but map that out for people and make it plain. And then that can probably help more with retention. And again, maybe not retention specifically in field service, but keeping that talent within the organization, so that you don't lose the history and the experience and whatever passion they already have for what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay. So in summary, let's say we had this conversation a few years ago. Here we are having it again, and hopefully people are ready to listen this time. What would be your closing words of wisdom for people that are now ready to hear what you're saying?
Take responsibility. It's our fault. Right, like we have to own it, and I'm not one to defend HR. We all have our struggles with recruitment, but we reward we incentivize the behavior we reward. If you keep getting candidates and they're not the kind of candidates you want, but you keep hiring them, then human resources and recruiting is doing their job.
Right.
So we have to own it, right? If we see the price of a new employee going up, if we see attrition from new employees, that have been here for a year or two taking other jobs, then we've got to own that and understand what we need to do to better retain our talent, and also to give people more opportunities to grow within the organization. But we just have to own it, and we should be proactive. We all have to react right now because we don't have a choice, but we also have to think past the immediate problem. Right? So like I said, we've got to start worrying about how do we do outreach to high schools that are doing alternative paths and people not going to universities for 4 years? How do we work with workforce development agencies at the state level, at the federal level? How do we bring back apprenticeships, right? To and really be able to offer an entry level position where we can trust, right? There's limiting things for field service, like credit cards, right? A lot of us got rid of company cards. A lot of us require people to rent vehicles. Most of that stuff you can't do under 21, right? So there are even fundamental roadblocks and obstacles that we have that we could eliminate, or that we could create some mitigations for that really allow us to develop the next generation of talent that we'll need for field service. But we have to own it and take responsibility and take action.
Roy, thank you for being here with me. I appreciate it. You can find more by visiting us at futureoffieldservice.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn as well as Twitter at @thefutureofs. The Future of Field Service podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.